Let's say welcome to the show, Kieran McAnulty from Labor. Kieran, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no worries. How are you getting on?
Very well, actually. Very, very busy. Very good to have you on board. Thank you so much for coming on board and saying g'day to us. I thought what we'd do is, because I saw you on the news talking to the Kainga Ora conversation, we'd reach out and see if you wanted to talk about it in a bit more detail. We love TVNZ News. We love News Hub. But, the 18 seconds they give you, we think maybe we can talk a bit more to it. We just think we could. So I thought what we'd do is, everyone's down with it, down with the kids and that, is maybe play the story from One News tonight, the Kainga Ora story, which gives a little bit of background, and then expand upon it. Because apparently now Kainga Ora bad, and rattling sabres of cuts needed, which of course leads those of us who are pessimists to worry about things like private partnerships and privatization. None of that's been said, but those of us who like to jump to conclusions tend to go in that direction. But let's have a look at the story together, and then let's talk about it at the end. Thank you for joining us again, Kieran.
A scathing review of public housing agency Kainga Ora has found the performance of the country's biggest landlord is deteriorating as it racks up billions of dollars of debt with little accountability. The report recommends a shake-up at the organisation, and a new chairman has already been announced. But organisations working with those in need say the government must continue to build more homes despite rising costs. Political editor Mikey Sherman reports.
Kainga Ora, the country's biggest social housing landlord, on notice from the government.
We've not been satisfied with the performance of Kainga Ora in managing its finances and its assets.
An independent review led by former Prime Minister Sir Bill English has delivered a scathing report saying the performance of Kainga Ora is deteriorating. Kainga Ora is not financially viable, it is not delivering the homes and support people need, and cites a lack of transparency and accountability, limited attention to value for money, and a poor understanding of tenant outcome.
Now, some of those sentences, Chewy and Kieran, probably the most frightening is Kainga Ora is not financially viable. When I hear that, I think Kainga Ora provides a service primarily. And I know it's on a different scale, but it feels a bit like saying libraries, yeah, right, libraries aren't financially viable. It seems to be something that's more of a service than not. And if it's not financially viable, what is this government then going to do with it? Seem to be focused so much on the bottom line. We're going to keep going as well, Kieran, but would you like to speak to that before we go?
Yeah, that line stood out for me too. And what was really front of mind was the bloke that ran this review was Finance Minister for 9 years when that government extracted a dividend from Housing New Zealand. So, I think that's the lens by which they're looking at this. We don't see Kainga Ora or the provision of social houses as an opportunity to extract revenue for the government. We see it as a platform to build houses for Kiwi whānau. It's as simple as that. And that's the fundamental ideological difference between National and Labour, or the right and the left.
Yeah, and there as well, the second line from the bottom, limited attention to value for money. That smacks of, I want a return on my investment. I want to see a financial dividend to the investment that the country is making, which kind of speaks to what you're saying, I think, a little bit, Kieran.
Yeah, it does. I do want to say one thing, though, is that, of course, we should ensure that money that's spent is value for money. But I was going to speak to this later, but further on in this clip, Mikey Sherman mentions that it's cheaper for community housing providers to build houses. That's actually inaccurate. It is Kainga Ora builds houses cheaper per square metre than community housing providers. So there's your value for money. So I reckon we should just strike a line through that one.
Okay, let's do that, and we'll keep on going.
Today is about fixing the finances of Kainga Ora, or at least starting the process.
Kainga Ora has total assets of $45 billion and annual expenditure of $2.5 billion, but its debt grew from $2.7 billion in 2018 to $12.3 billion in June last year, and is forecast to almost double that in 4 years' time.
So maybe what we've got you here, Kieran, explain that to us. It's gone up 10 billion over 6 years, and then going to be another, then it's going to double in the next 4 years because
there's a massive figure missing in this graphic, and that's what the total assets were in 2018. So you got 3 at the bottom there, and you've only got 2 at the top. And if they had total assets in 2018, it would tell the complete picture, because debt has grown, but so too have the assets. and that 12.3 billion is roughly a quarter of the total assets. If we look back to the Housing Corporation back in the 80s and 90s, they were leveraging at 80% debt to equity. So actually, when you consider in 2018, when New Zealand Housing was simply a body that National had stripped down, that was transferring houses from the state to community housing organisations or selling them, it's gone from that to an organisation that has $45 billion of assets, that has created 14,000 public houses alongside community housing providers, and out of that has $12.3 billion of debt. So there's the context there, which I think is really important to understand the full picture.
Do we have any idea, or do you know the numbers for 2018? What the how much was the asset value of Kainga Ora?
As I was screaming out for some context there, I was thinking, God, I really wish I had that number on me.
What about projecting when we have 23 billion? Obviously, it's because houses are being built and properties are being built, and that costs money. Is there any projection for the 23 billion? Once it's 23, is it going to therefore be $90 billion worth of assets? Is it going to double and double? Or?
It's projected to peak within a few years, and then the relative scale of the assets to the debt will mean that debt will start to reduce. Now, I know that this is a long way away, but we're talking about 70-year assets here. By 2060, there will be over $250 billion of assets there and $9 billion debt. So there's the prediction. So you can draw the lines between now and 2060. This is as it should be when you're considering a government department that is only a matter of years old and was required to hit the ground running right from the get-go. It would be inaccurate to say that they started from a standing footing, because actually they started behind the starting line, because in the 9 years of National, they ended up with 1,500 fewer houses than what they started on. And so not only did we have to try and fill that void before we built some houses, we also had to maintain the ones that they neglected over that 9-year period. So I'm afraid this just doesn't quite tell the full story.
Yeah, and speaking of the full story, because we have the smartest viewers in New Zealand, Peter's just come up saying the 2018-2019 annual report says assets of 28.6 billion. So
thank you, Peter. Thank you very much.
So in other words, we've now got 45 billion. We had 28 billion. So yeah, I mean, I know this is oversimplification and some people shouldn't do this, but if I had $1 million worth of debt on $2 million worth of property, and I doubled it to $2 million worth of debt, but I had $50 million worth of property, it's not just about that number, is it? About what you're getting for it and what the equity you have and whatever it is, the assets you have for it as well.
I'd like to think that a future government would never sell down that asset, but what it means is that the ability to be able to leverage that in future to then build more houses is far greater. And so, I'm sure we hear it all the time. I certainly do, by those that might not be completely engaged in politics will say, there's not much difference between National and Labor. Well, I would argue that in workplace relations and in housing, you've got two prime examples where there are gulfs between the two.
Isn't it funny, Chewy, when you have like time to talk out an issue rather than 18 seconds on the news, you can kind of get to the nub of it every now and again. Chewy, do you want to jump in now? Or should we keep going? You can save your firing to the end.
Your voting block happy if you give context to your numbers. Look at how the numbers start small and get big. Labor bad. Yeah, look, if you were a private landowner, maybe say a landlord, and were leveraging debt to get more assets, the bank would be sweet with it. Yeah, because capital gains is a thing. The value is only going to go up, right? Well, you can't have a government organisation doing that. Luckily, we don't have a housing crisis and everybody has a nice, safe home.
Well, the cheapest day to build a house
that's what I said.
Yeah. And of course, we've had 7 months of nothing. I know we're partway through a clip here, but they came into office promising that they would build more houses than Labor, And when you consider that the number of houses that were built in the last 6 years was the highest number since the 1950s, that was a pretty big claim. And in 7 months, they haven't announced a single policy that has led to an additional house. In fact, their refusal to commit to funding beyond 2025 has led to the likes of Salvation Army to cancel developments because they don't have funding security and they simply can't take on that risk without knowing whether the money's coming or not.
Gotcha. So extra value for private landlords because they know that there's not any dilution of the supply coming. So then when you've got people that need housed and private rentals and are getting the accommodation supplement topped up, we're still paying for housing. It's just we don't own it. The country doesn't own it.
The irony here, unfortunately, is that this is assuming that National will be making some announcement around funding for housing at the budget. They didn't wait for the budget to announce $2.9 billion of tax cuts for landlords, but they're dragging their heels and refusing to commit whether they're funding additional public housing places beyond 2025. Well, as a direct result of that decision and that choice, the momentum is stalled. And this is at a time when the arse is falling out of the construction sector and literally hundreds and thousands of tradespeople are leaving for Australia because their bosses are telling them, we don't have much work beyond next month.
Yep. And then they won't be able to get them back and that'll make it 10 times worse. We're going to keep rolling.
Of record training of apprentices. Well, we've put all that investment in and they've buggered off to Aussie. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them at all.
All right, let's keep rolling with the story and then we'll come back to some more chats.
Isn't it, by and large, simply the reality of needing to build housing on a large scale to meet a housing crisis?
Well, that is true to some extent. The Crown and the government and Cabinet is worried about that level of debt because ultimately that's on the Crown balance sheet. New Zealanders have to borrow that money to pay for that.
We had to set it up from the ground. And we've
good looking chap, don't you think, Chewy? It's a good looking chap in front of the TV right now, eh?
Very
nicely
smooth.
good. I know that there's not going to be no one in our chat complaining about the standard of your beard. It's all looking good. Kapai.
delivered around 14,000 public homes through both community housing providers and Kainga Ora. It's like they've only just realised it costs money to build houses.
I think it's a choice the government has to make, and I would like to see it put investment into building new homes for people because that's where the need is. We need more houses.
Auckland community housing organisations want financial assurance from the government.
They agreed that they would build 1,000 new state houses annually, and the need is great. So it is important that they remain true to that commitment.
We want to grow the number of social houses in New Zealand. That's a different issue to whether or not we want the number of state houses owned by Kainga Ora to increase.
And on state houses,
Hang on. I'm going to go back for that because I missed that on the night as well. It sounds like you're saying we want more social houses, but maybe Kainga Ora aren't the people to do it. I just want to listen to that again. I'll pause it after this comment. I can see you firing up, Chewy. Let's just have a look.
Social houses in New Zealand. That's a different issue to whether or not we want the number of state houses owned by Kainga Ora to increase.
So more social housing, but maybe we'll put to the side of the conversation Kainga Ora leads to what, Chewy?
That leads to more private landlords, whether it is through social housing, through religious charity groups or some other charity structure or public-private ownership, that sort of thing. He's just decided against all evidence since before World War II that the best social housing project is one that the government runs and can do at massive scale. That doesn't work. Never works. How many New Zealanders got raised in state houses?
Bro.
Yeah, and what is the problem that we have been talking about and various governments acknowledging, denying, doesn't happen? We don't have a housing crisis. John Key said that for years. No such thing. Never mind. Don't worry about it. People living in cars, it's fine. Sweet as. It counts as a roof. And then we have, during the Ardern government, this massive binge of housing, like a generational run of building more houses. And no one's going to keep that up. These guys aren't going to do it because it's going to affect the bottom line of landlords. More supply of housing, lower rents. This is the downward pressure that they are so keen on, but they're not going to do it. You want to bring a price down, you add more of the product. That is just basic economics.
We're not going away from the story, but we'll just come for a second because I to be honest, I missed that when I was queuing this all up. I watched this on One News and I watched it again and I missed it. I just heard it then for the first time. Kieran, you're obviously in that building yelling at those people across the house. What do they mean when they're saying, yeah, more social housing? Absolutely. Maybe not for Kainga Ora though. What does that mean? And how do you guys react to that?
Well, what I'm about to say is not even a paraphrase or an interpretation. I can repeat what he said in the press conference because he went to some effort to clarify what he meant. By social housing, he means the provision of housing not by Kainga Ora, but by community housing providers. That is entirely consistent with their position leading up to the election, and it is entirely consistent with the entire 9 years of the Key and English government. The National Party do not believe that it is the state's responsibility to provide houses. They believe it's their responsibility to fiddle around with planning laws and help facilitate community housing providers to do what I would wager the three of us and many of the people watching would think is actually the state's responsibility. And that's the crux of the problem. We've been down this road before. We've heard this rhetoric before. And where we ended up was with 1,500 fewer houses, because if the government doesn't help community housing providers pay for the new builds, they don't happen. And what I mean by that is through the income-related rent subsidy. So when people talk about social houses, they mean tenants in a house that pay no more than 25% of their income on rent, and the rest is topped up by the government. And that security of funding is all that the community housing providers need to go and sign off on a new development and build new homes, because they know that that money will come through. But the government hasn't committed to that funding. They didn't through the 9 years of Key government, and they haven't so far in this government. And all that will happen is that the progress that we've made will stall and go backwards. And that was the massive omission from today. If they came out today and said, we are going to confirm the funding beyond 2025 for the next 4 years, or for 6,000 houses like we did in our manifesto, then we actually would have acknowledged that. We still would have made many of the points that we did, but at least they've given the sector certainty. But they don't still know where they stand. And it's just not going to go anywhere. It's just a fact. There's so many examples that we can point to demonstrate that.
It's I don't want to go down a let's beat up the media conversation here, but it's not just that the government leaves out numbers or leaves out real information. It's that the media then doesn't nail it down. So this is a TVNZ report on the news. Fair enough, but we're losing more and more of that kind of intelligent, let's dig down into the numbers now and actually tell people what they're saying. And if they had just whipped by and we hadn't seen it, then they would have said it, and it would have been like, yeah, we've always said that the whole way through. It does concern me.
I will give Mikey some defense here, is that I imagine that the inclusion of that statement was a deliberate choice to provide context into the story. And it was as a result of her asking, isn't the financial position of Kainga Ora simply as a result because they have built a record number of homes in very difficult 6 years? And he conceded that that was correct, and then went on to say, well, actually, our position is that we want more social houses, but maybe not by Kainga Ora. I think that's incredibly telling, and the fact they included that does provide that context. But I do concede, though, that you sort of need to understand some part of the incredibly complex situation where we've got the funding streams for this and the difference between state houses and social houses and public homes and income-related rents, etc., etc. mate, it took me a while to get my head around the portfolio.
Yeah.
But I asked for it for a reason, because I'm bloody passionate about it. And if we've got time, I'll give you a brief explanation as to why. I live in Masterton, and in 1999, the national government sold every single state house in my region to the local licensing trust.
Wow.
Ooh.
And, you know, they've done the best they can, but they are a licensing trust. And for the first few years, you know, it takes some time to get your head around the complexities of running community housing. And so between when they sold them and when we came in 2017, the number of public homes available to the Wairarapa community went down by the hundreds, because they weren't supported by the government. There was a period where the demand wasn't there, so there wasn't the need. But then during the key years, the demand shot through the roof, but the funding wasn't there. And I fought incredibly hard as the local MP to bring government housing back to Wairarapa. And I'm bloody proud to say that I did. And it's only because Kainga Ora came back to Wairarapa and the Tararua district that they had the first public houses built in 20 years. And it's the only way it happens.
Yeah. Just before we move on as well, just to want to reiterate that point about what Mikey asked about, you know, building houses. To go back again to the 2018, $2.7 billion worth of debt for $28 billion worth of assets. They add 10, you guys add $10 billion, so it's now 12.3, and have about $20 billion more worth of assets. It seems like a pretty good return on investment. $10 billion for an additional $20 billion worth of assets from what we had when you guys got in.
And
so,
it's a generational change. It's not what they're doing is they're pointing at that graph of number go up. Number go up is bad, but it's not going to ramp like that forever. Eventually, we're going to reach a point where we have enough social housing. You know, all of these houses that have been sold, all of these houses that had to be brought up to a healthy home standard because they were houses that were built in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, are now replaced.
They needed to be upgraded as well. So a lot of the funding that went into Kainga Ora was not just to build homes, but to was actually bring the old stock up to grade.
And people need different types of houses now. The idea of a 3 or 4 bedroom home with a quarter-acre section is incredibly outdated. It's not how we live now, and we can get more housing into that space. And like everything that this government seems to want to talk about, it's at very shallow level. They don't talk about the flow-on benefits like you were saying of like, okay, so now our building companies and our apprentices are up against the gun and they're looking at other countries. They don't look at those benefits. They don't look at the things that they would improve right throughout the country, right throughout all of our communities of like, here are workers getting paychecks and staying in this country and starting families and all of that flow on. It just seems there is always a very surface profit and loss statement way of approaching every problem that we have in this country.
Yeah. It's like this government doesn't put any value, financial value, in social good, although that has to always be a part. Like they ignore it. They think it's not a part of the equation. Or they might verbalize that it is, but their actions say that they don't value the social good of whatever the policy is above the financial return or the investment into it financially or the, you know, the profit and loss column, and they stop about there. And they say, we can't, as they're giving $3 billion back to landlords.
And I think especially coming from Bishop, MP for Hutt South, where hundreds of state-owned houses were knocked down, demoed, tried to be sold off, and empty sections sitting there for years during a housing crisis. That was his electorate. So I can't see how he would be unaware of that.
The interesting thing is, you're right, they do choose to look at things from a financial or an economic point of view while discarding the social cost. But if we were to leave that to one side and just look at a financial situation, they haven't talked about the cost of homelessness. financial sense. And not only the cost of emergency housing, they've been rattling on about that for years, and yet they don't see the connection between building state houses and saving money on emergency housing, or the cost of the health system, etc., etc. The cost of families that have to move from region to region because they have unstable households and going from school to school, etc. None of this is factored in. They just look at the cost and the debt, and that's it. And it doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of the whole story, let's just get back to it, HOE, and we'll get back to this, and then we could wrap at the end and let Kieran go before midnight, just to be fair. So let's get to the end of the story.
And on state houses, one big call.
I can rule out a mass sell-off of state houses,
while plenty of other decisions are still to be made.
Mass.
All right, a lot of decisions ahead, Mikey. So what happens from here?
Well, the report made 7 recommendations. The government has already accepted 4 of those recommendations, including a complete renewal of the Kainga Ora board. Now, that is essentially a vote of no confidence in the Kainga Ora leadership. But there are other...
One wonders the colour of the political party the new board will support. One wonders.
Issues the government still needs to consider, including whether community housing providers should build more of the social housing stock because they deliver it at a more cost-efficient model product than Kainga Ora does at the moment. The government also wants to scrap Kiwi Build. No great surprise, but it needs to decide what it will replace that with. It is also putting question marks over some of the housing funding schemes. Think the first home loan and other progressive housing schemes. The government wants to decide what it does with those, saying Kainga Ora has simply had too much on its plate. Now, all of those decisions which remain unanswered, still to be determined, they will be covered off in a report back at the end of the year.
So, as I said, Bill English did the report, I believe. The board's gone, and one can only hazard a guess at the colour of the politics of the new board coming in, Chewy.
A fantastic independent inquiry headed by an ex-national leader and Prime Minister who was part of a government that sold off state houses fucking wholesale. I love that. How far can we stretch the word independent before it's completely transparent? What a fucking joke. It's a job system for mates.
But it's also a stupid thing to say because we all know this. But if it was the other way around, and there was a former Labour minister or Green minister outside of that, James Shaw got put in charge of that or something like that, that National would be having conniptions over the wrong person and the bias of the reports coming out and stuff, and they just go and do it. And if you weren't here, Kieran, I'd probably say both sides will do it. It's a frustration of politics, but, this thing's particularly egregious.
Yeah, I would say it's the equivalent of a future Labour government in many, many years to come, putting Megan Woods as chair of a review in Kainga Ora. But there's a massive difference. That would be, and we'd be totally transparent that we want to build houses, and so we put a minister who has a track record of building houses to review an organisation to see how they could build more houses. They should be transparent and say, we don't believe it's the state's role to build houses, so we're going to get the bloke that oversaw the reduction of state houses to review it so that we can see the best way to transfer houses from the state to the community housing providers. That would be honest. But they haven't said that, even though they've alluded to it in the campaign.
Chewy, we can let Kieran go shortly, but what are we wrapping up with? There's a few chats and stuff in there. Is there any questions directly for Kieran that we want to talk to him, or anything else you want to add?
Control. I want to cover off a couple of things. Like my dad is renting and gets an accommodation supplement, and the place that he's in at the moment is a basement rat hole in Timaru, charging absolute top dollar rent, and that's topped up by MSD. And so that's always my comparison. It's like we're paying for that right throughout the country. People in private rentals where landlords can just charge whatever the fuck they want because it's market rent. And the government's making the choice of doing that through accommodation supplements rather than spending the money of building a more generational approach like housing. That's not right, right? That doesn't sit right. And that's been a problem, it's like for decades. Decades now, accommodation supplement has been a rort for private landlords. What, if we knock these guys out in a one term, hopefully, what would be your approach to solving that problem?
The best thing to do is to, one, remove the stigma of income-related rents and government or community-provided houses, and look at places like Vienna, where it's ingrained in their society, and a massive proportion of people live in these houses. They know they've got them for life. There's no stigma attached to it. There's no government subsidies of private rentals because the local government has provided enough housing for its people for 100 years, and the society is committed to that and say that is a home is a right, and they will ensure that it happens. And essentially, if there is enough houses for people, there'll be less pressure on the private rental market. That will stabilise, and there'll be few instances where people need to access the accommodation allowance. It's a simplified response, but it's pretty straightforward. And what worried me, since you've mentioned accommodation allowance, what worried me is Chris Bishop referred to housing associations as a potential solution to this. Now, this is derived from the UK model, and this is something that they've been looking at for a long time. I came across a 2010 report that Bill English commissioned, which referred to the UK model. Now, of all the examples of social housing provision in Europe, UK would be the last one that I would point to as an example of what to do. The right to buy scheme that Thatcher brought in allowed a lot of state housing or council housing tenants to buy their homes. Great, that's awesome. But she then blocked providers from building new houses. And over a couple of generations, those houses were inevitably sold to landlords. And so the tenants in those houses have to get accommodation supplement from the state. So that society has paid for those houses and the provision of houses 3 times, building them, subsidising the sale of them, and now subsidising the rent of them back to private landlords. It is a disaster. And it is one of the least affordable markets in Europe. It is just crazy in my mind that we would want to look to emulate that when we've got a system that, yes, it's expensive, but that's the nature of building houses. But we were getting there, and people could see that houses were being built, so they saw some hope, so they would actually put their hand up to go on the register. If the national government under Key built houses at the rate we did, we wouldn't have a housing crisis. It's as simple as that. History is going to repeat itself.
Yeah, national reading the Tories' notes seems to be a theme, and a very worrying one. My second question for you is to do with something close to home down here in Dunedin. Are you familiar with the Arran Court Lodge?
I am, actually.
Yeah, so that was, for those that don't know, is a motor park here in Dunedin that was bought for COVID response, MIQ, and then I think Kainga Ora took it over with the intention of building social housing. Here in Dunedin, we have a homeless encampment next to the motorway, and a big piece of property that was bought for social housing that has sat empty ever since. That obviously started under Labor. What's happening here? I mean, you say you're familiar with it. Is there anything that you would like to add about where that's at, or what pressure the current government is under to do something with it?
I became aware of it because the minister was on local radio a couple of weeks ago, I think, and was asked about it. And then that came up on my media feeds. I basically get an alert on any housing story that's published in New Zealand media. So I looked into it. I'm still looking into it as to why that is. There is some difficulty in developing that land. I know that much, and it's not as straightforward as a piece of land that was purchased and they're sitting on it and have just decided not to do anything with it. It's not straightforward. I know that the intention is to develop that land because it is close to transport links, and you can actually get quite a lot of houses in there. But so often, particularly when things were bought for one purpose, like in COVID, and then they think, well, we've got this, so we may as well look to develop it. It's not an easy transfer.
Right.
So look, I don't want to make excuses. Obviously, we want to develop the land. I just point out that it's not as straightforward as perhaps it's being portrayed.
All right. And Chewy's done a lot of work on that as well. I don't know if the story you saw was Hamish from Stuff down here who wrote about it, but I think it's fair to say, Chewy, you fed him a bunch of information that potentially started getting that story going. So that's a bit of a passion
I
project.
walk past it every day.
Yeah.
And I'm just, someone in that homeless encampment died earlier in this year, and we're going into another winter of people living in tents. And it's one of those things that you're just like, there's a roof there, at the bare minimum.
Yeah. We particularly if there's any land that has been built for housing, we need to make sure that we can do whatever we can to build on that. Casting aspersions over the credibility of Kainga Ora and its long-term viability and whether or not it should indeed exist for that purpose is not going to result in a speedy outcome for that development, I'm afraid. I have very little faith in the intentions of this government because I believe that they have been disingenuous. You may remember the Chris Luxon's State of the Nation speech earlier in the year. He stated that when they became in government, there was a piece of advice sitting on their desk that said that Kainga Ora was going to sell 10,000 homes. And they used that to question the viability of Kainga Ora. Well, actually, it turns out after doing a bit of digging and asking some questions and official information and all that sort of stuff, it wasn't sitting there. Nicola Willis actually commissioned that advice. And it was as a result of a conversation with the Secretary of the Treasury, which MHUD and Kainga Ora have confirmed to me that it was as a result of an indication that there may not be funding post-2025. And the advice that Kainga Ora was likely to sell 10,000 homes was on the assumption that there wouldn't be additional funding. But that's not how they presented it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's dishonest. And just an example that they have taken every opportunity, whether legitimate or not, to try and discredit Kainga Ora.
Kieran, I feel like you're part of the whānau now because you come on board for a 15-minute chat and we talk for 40 minutes. So that's official. This is sort of how we roll in our 90-minute hours. So thank you so much for giving us some time. I was going to say one more thing. You were talking about looking to Vienna as a good example of perhaps how housing is handled. Like if you guys needed like a fact-finding trip, I'm sure me and Chewy could, put ourselves forward to head across there and find some information for you and bring it. Are you up for that, Chewy? A fact-finding trip to Vienna? Yeah. So just look, I know we like to give, so we're just offering, Kieran, if you're,
Well, look, I mean, I'm sure if that can be arranged, who knows, there might be some sponsors that are watching that said, yeah, that might be a good use of our funds. I've got a good mate of mine from Marston that's over there. I'm sure he'll be able to show you around.
There you go.
You a cultural tour as well as a housing tour.
BHN meetup in Vienna. Sounds like a good thing. Hey, Kieran, thanks so much for joining us, man. Really appreciate your time. We will keep on going and we'll be in touch when we want to hear more than 18 seconds on TVNZ News.
Cheers, lads. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.